We're talking about a fascinating new documentary from CBS Reports exploring the American bison's return from the brink of extinction. 100 years ago, the iconic bison were overhunted and nearly wiped out as a result, but conservation efforts...
Nobody expected it. Hundreds of wild bison were dumped into the scorching desert and left alone for a decade. No fences, no daily checkups, just the heat, dust, and the ghosts of a lost ecosystem. 10 years later, scientists returned, and what they found was beyond anyone's wildest expectations. It wasn't just a success, it was a miracle. But how did this happen? And why did bison, of all creatures, become the unexpected heroes of one of the most remarkable environmental comebacks in modern history? The fall of the Prairie Kings. Long before anyone thought of using bison to fix an ecosystem, they were the kings of the North American plains. These weren't just animals, they were thunder on the horizon. 60 million of them once roamed freely across the grasslands, shaping the land with every stomp and breath. For centuries, indigenous peoples lived alongside them, drawing food, clothing, tools, and even spiritual meaning from the presence of the bison. But when settlers arrived with rifles, railroads, and profit in mind, the kingdom crumbled fast. By the mid-1800s, the mass slaughter began. Bison were killed not just for their meat or hides, but as part of a grim strategy to weaken native populations who depended on them. Trains ran across the plains, with passengers shooting bison from the windows just for sport. The landscape that once shook with life fell silent. The herds of millions dwindled to mere hundreds. By 1889, only 541 wild bison were left alive. It was an extinction event playing out in real time, and barely anyone noticed. But this wasn't just happening in the United States. South of the border, across the deserts and plateaus of northern Mexico, the story was equally tragic. Bison once roamed those dry northern plains too, grazing and fertilizing the soil with each hoofstep. But colonial and post-colonial Mexico followed the same path as the North. Bison were hunted, consumed, traded, and discarded. Their meat became food for soldiers and settlers. Their hides turned into currency. Even their tongues became prized delicacies. And just like that, they were gone. By the turn of the 20th century, no free-ranging bison herds were left in Mexico. The disappearance of bison didn't just remove a species, it collapsed an entire system. These animals weren't just big, they were ecological engineers. They carved patterns into the land, fertilized the soil with natural precision, and played an invisible hand in shaping plant and animal communities. Without them, the prairies began to unravel. What used to be endless plains of wild grasses became invaded by shrubs and invasive weeds. The soil turned brittle. Erosion swept away the topsoil. Water that once soaked into the land now ran off, carving gullies and drying out aquifers. Something essential was gone, and the land responded with silence. Farmers tried to fill the gap with cattle, but cows were domesticated creatures. They didn't roam with purpose. They lingered, grazed the same spots into dust, and compacted the soil into lifeless crusts. Their impact was more like slow-motion destruction than restoration. And still, the land kept drying up. As the 20th century turned into the 21st, the situation became impossible to ignore. In the northern state of Chihuahua, Mexico's desertified grasslands had become a case study in collapse. Prairie dog colonies, once covering vast areas, had shrunk by more than 70%. Biodiversity was plummeting. Entire communities of birds, rodents, and insects were vanishing. What once supported hundreds of interconnected species had become a patchwork of arid fields and abandoned farms. And then, from 1,400 miles away, a wild idea took shape. In South Dakota, the Wind Cave bison herd had been quietly thriving. These weren't your average livestock bison either. Their genes were remarkably pure, untouched by cattle interbreeding. And with the herd's numbers growing strong and healthy, conservationists realized they had something special, something ancient, something powerful enough to turn the tide. So in 2009, a convoy of trailers began a historic journey. Inside were 23 bison, bound for a place where none of their kind had walked in over a century. The destination was the Llanos Biosphere Reserve in northern Mexico. a harsh, unforgiving landscape once full of life and now teetering on collapse. The plan sounded like something out of a children's fable. Take a few dozen wild animals, drop them into a dying land, and hope they remember how to fix it. There were no guarantees. There was barely a precedent. But they released the bison anyway, opened the gates, and stepped back. And then they waited. What happened over the next 10 years would shock even the most optimistic scientists. But what made these bison so uniquely capable of pulling off the impossible? The desert awakens. When the bison were released into the Janos Biosphere Reserve, it wasn't a graceful moment. These weren't sleek animals gliding into a paradise. They stumbled off trucks into a harsh, dry wilderness that barely resembled the grasslands their ancestors once ruled. The desert didn't roll out a welcome mat. It was dusty, brittle, and unforgiving. But something remarkable happened almost immediately. These bison didn't hesitate. They didn't wait for instructions. They just got to work, without even knowing they were working. At first glance, bison seem like chaotic tanks on legs. But look closer, and you start to see a quiet logic in everything they do. They walk, a lot. Some days more than 1.5 miles across cracked ground and patchy vegetation. And with every step, they're stirring up the soil, breaking hardened surfaces, and creating tiny pathways for water to infiltrate. These aren't footprints. They're invitations for life to return. It may sound strange, but bison are masters of low-impact destruction. Unlike cows, which tend to stand around and churn the earth into sterile mud pits, bison keep moving. They don't linger. Their instinct tells them to graze and go, graze and go. That natural restlessness creates a patchy mosaic across the landscape. Some parts get disturbed, others rest. That balance is the secret sauce that cattle never figured out. And that difference matters more than anyone expected. Within months of their arrival, scientists noticed subtle shifts. The crusty soil began to change texture. When rare rains came, instead of bouncing off the surface or rushing away in shallow floods, the water started sinking in. Seeds that had been lying dormant for decades finally had a chance to sprout. Grasses began poking through the cracks. Even the air smelled different. Then came the manure. Each adult bison drops over 50 pounds of nutrient-rich dung every single day. This natural fertilizer comes preloaded with nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and a dozen other trace elements that prairie plants have evolved to crave. And because bison roam far and wide, that fertilizer gets evenly distributed across miles of land, restoring a nutrient cycle that had been broken for generations. But bison aren't just mobile fertilizer machines. They're also seed spreaders. With their thick fur, they pick up all sorts of plant seeds during their daily treks. And when they stop to roll, usually to scratch an itch, shake off insects, or just enjoy a bit of dusty relaxation, they create shallow depressions in the earth. These wallows become perfect nurseries. The seeds fall off, settle into disturbed soil, and have just enough shelter and water to take root. Even more fascinating, those wallows collect rainwater, turning into miniature wetlands where frogs, insects, and birds begin to gather. That's right, bison roll around for fun, and the entire ecosystem benefits. It didn't take long for people to notice something deeper happening. Vegetation was returning not in uniform waves, but in an elegant patchwork. Some spots were covered in short grass, others grew tall. That uneven pattern isn't just visually striking, it's ecologically vital. Different animals prefer different grass heights, and bison create the full menu. This mosaic grazing nurtures more life than any controlled agricultural system could ever dream of. One by one, the silent players of the ecosystem began to reappear. The prairie dogs, which had nearly vanished, started returning to dig their intricate underground cities. Their return had a domino effect. Those burrows aerate the soil and trap moisture, creating another layer of fertility. And their waste, like the bison's, adds nutrients to the soil. Prairie dogs also graze, keeping the vegetation short and stopping invasive shrubs from taking over. Basically, the bison didn't just bring themselves back, they opened the door for others to return, too. And still, the herd grew. From the original 23 individuals, the population began to rise steadily. By 2018, the number had crossed 200. This wasn't just survival, it was a full-blown comeback. But the most remarkable change wasn't in the numbers. It was in the land itself. Soils that once cracked under the heat began to hold moisture. Wildflowers started popping up in unexpected places. Pollinators returned. Birds sang in places that had been silent for decades. In short, life was rearranging itself around the bison, as if the land had been holding its breath, waiting for them to come back. Even the weather seemed to respond. Not in any mystical way, but in a scientifically measurable one. Moisture retention improved, vegetative cover expanded. The microclimate began to cool slightly in bison-active areas. It was as if the animals were acting like engineers, not just reviving a few scattered plants, but kickstarting an entire environmental system from the ground up. The locals, too, began to see the change. Farmers who once considered the land a lost cause started to notice healthier pastures. The government began expanding protected areas, and biologists started dreaming even bigger. Could the return of bison actually reverse desertification? Could their movement reshape the very fate of this once barren region? Or was this just the beginning of something far more ambitious? A chain reaction of life. As the bison settled into their new home in Janos, something fascinating unfolded across the landscape, and it wasn't just about the grass returning or the soil softening under their hooves. What emerged was a ripple effect that reached far beyond the herd itself, awakening layers of the ecosystem that had long gone silent. The bison didn't know it, but with each movement, they were setting off a chain reaction of life, a kind of ecological renaissance that spread out from the herd in every direction and affected everything from rodents to raptors. The first to benefit from the bison's return were the black-tailed prairie dogs. These small, sociable rodents had once been plentiful in northern Mexico, shaping the soil with their burrows and playing a key role in maintaining grassland health. But without the bison to graze the grasses down and keep predators in check, their colonies had collapsed over the years. Prairie dogs are not just cute little diggers, they are ecological engineers in their own right. They create vast networks of tunnels that help aerate the soil, allow for better water penetration, and improve nutrient cycling, and they provide shelter for dozens of other species, including snakes, owls, insects, and even small mammals that would otherwise have no home in a degraded prairie. As bison reshaped the grassland into a patchy mix of short and tall vegetation, it gave prairie dogs exactly what they needed. These rodents thrive in open, low-cut spaces where they can spot predators from afar and dart into burrows at the first sign of trouble. Without that short grass cover, they're sitting ducks for hawks and coyotes. But when the bison came back and began their natural, selective grazing patterns, they created the conditions prairie dogs had been waiting for. The rodents returned to the landscape not just in isolated pockets, but in expanding colonies, re-establishing their complex underground communities. What's more, their presence amplified the benefits of bison movement by further stirring the soil, redistributing nutrients, and continuing the cycle of disturbance that grasslands need to flourish. Then came the black-footed ferrets. Once believed to be extinct, these elusive predators depend almost entirely on prairie dog colonies for both food and shelter. Ferrets don't dig their own homes. They move into abandoned prairie dog burrows, where they raise their young and hide from larger predators. And they don't hunt a wide variety of prey. They almost exclusively eat prairie dogs. A single ferret family can consume hundreds of them each year. And without a healthy prairie dog population, ferrets simply cannot survive. With the prairie dogs returning in force, biologists saw an opportunity to reintroduce ferrets into the area and began carefully monitoring both species to ensure the balance could be maintained. It's rare to find such a tightly wound ecological relationship where one species is almost entirely dependent on another, but in the grasslands of North America, that bond is everything. And if that wasn't enough, another creature made its quiet comeback, the burrowing owl. Unlike other owls that prefer tree hollows and thick forest cover, this bird thrives in the open prairie. It uses old prairie dog burrows as nesting sites and relies on the rodent's vigilant nature for survival. Prairie dogs have complex vocal warning systems and a sharp eye for predators. When they sound the alarm, the burrowing owls take notice and escape alongside them. These birds also rely on the same short grass habitats as prairie dogs, and just like the ferrets, they find everything they need in these reshaped ecosystems: shelter, prey, and an early warning system that keeps them alive. The revival of one species became the security system for another, a beautiful example of how restoring just a few keystone players can create shelter, safety, and sustenance for an entire cast of characters. But it didn't stop there. Insects began to recolonize the rebounding grasslands, taking advantage of new flowering plants that grew from seeds carried in the bison's fur. Pollinators returned in larger numbers, bringing color and energy back to the landscape. Amphibians began appearing in the shallow depressions where bison had rolled and wallowed, their eggs resting in puddles that hadn't existed a year earlier. Even larger birds like hawks and eagles followed the signs of life, circling above the prairie with renewed interest as rodents returned in numbers worth watching. Coyotes, foxes, and snakes quietly crept back into the scene, drawn by the same network of life the bison had unknowingly rekindled. And all of it, every insect wing, every blade of grass, every blink from a prairie dog sentinel, traced back to those lumbering, shaggy giants walking the same paths their ancestors had once ruled. People began noticing that the land itself seemed to be breathing again. The wind carried more than just sand and dust now. It carried the sound of birds calling to one another, the rustling of tall grasses, and the low, distant bellows of a growing bison herd. It wasn't just about ecological success anymore. It had become an emotional revival for the communities nearby. Ranchers who had once written off the land as barren now visited with their children, pointing out signs of wildlife they hadn't seen in decades. Conservationists who once fought to protect mere fragments of a forgotten ecosystem now spoke confidently of an entire web of life making its way back. And scientists who studied bison as case studies in resilience now found themselves astonished at the speed and complexity of the recovery underway. If a few dozen bison can do this much in just a few years, what could happen if more degraded landscapes were given the same chance? What if bison were reintroduced across wider parts of their original range, not just as a symbol of wilderness, but as active participants in healing damaged lands? Would the deserts stay deserts, or would the prairies rise again? A legacy worth preserving. By now, the picture is clear. Bison are more than just remnants of a wild past. They are restorers of balance, stewards of the soil, and keystone architects of ecosystems that once teetered on the brink of collapse. What began with just 23 individuals in a dusty corner of Mexico has become a living, growing legacy, one that reconnects life across generations and across species. These animals don't need machines or irrigation systems to heal land. They do it simply by being who they are, by walking, grazing, rolling, and existing within an ecosystem that remembers how to respond when the right pieces fall into place. The beauty of it all lies in the fact that this wasn't some massive government-funded mega project with endless budgets and technology. It was a humble, determined experiment. Ecologists and conservationists believed that if they could just give bison a foothold, the land would remember. And it did. What returned wasn't just grass or rodents or owls. What returned was rhythm, movement, and balance. The kind that modern agriculture and development had erased in the name of short-term productivity. It's a reminder that sometimes the most advanced solution is the one nature already perfected thousands of years ago. Now, with the bison population in Llanos growing steadily and the grasslands pulsing with new life, the region stands as a symbol of hope. The prairie dogs are chattering again. The burrowing owls are nesting. The ferrets are hunting. And through it all, the bison roam. Their hooves press into ground that once cracked and crumbled. Their breath steams against morning air that once hung dry and lifeless. The ecosystem has found its heartbeat again. But the work isn't done. If this success story tells us anything, It's that rewilding isn't a dream, it's a decision, one that can be made again in more places, with more courage and less hesitation. What started with just a few bison in a forgotten patch of desert became one of the most inspiring environmental comebacks in modern memory. And if 23 bison can spark a revolution in Mexico, just imagine what could happen if we gave nature more chances to restore itself. Maybe the answer to healing our planet has been hiding in plain sight, walking on 4 hooves, carrying seeds in its fur, and leaving behind a trail of life wherever it roams.